Life is a series of choices, and with each choice comes consequence. The decision to leave home after 60 is often painted as a fresh start, an opportunity to downsize, to relocate, to seek comfort in new surroundings. Yet for many, what seems like a logical move becomes an unexpected source of loss. It is not merely the change of address that unsettles them. It is the displacement of identity, the disruption of familiarity, and the subtle but profound realization that the world does not rearrange itself to accommodate their presence the way it once did. The loss of rootedness is not a singular event, but an unfolding experience that begins the moment a person steps away from the ground that once held them. It's not about geography, it's about memory, history, and meaning condensed into a space that has become an extension of the self. A home lived in for decades becomes more than wood and stone. It becomes a silent witness to transformation, to resilience, to identity formed through repetition and routine. You wake up in the same room where your children once ran in with scraped knees and bright eyes. You walk through a hallway that remembers your worst days and your best triumphs, and somehow it never judges. The door creaks the same way it did when you first moved in, and the view from the window has watched you age quietly, steadily, as the seasons turned. There is a comfort in that continuity, a silent dialogue between you and the space that cradled your life as it unfolded. When that connection is severed, the rupture doesn't scream, it lingers. It creeps in slowly. First, it shows up in the way the new place smells wrong, sterile, empty of the invisible markers that once grounded you. Then it appears in the way you can't seem to settle your eyes. There's no familiar anchor, no object that holds shared time between you and the life you built. It's not just disorientation, it's the psychological dislocation of being unmoored from your own narrative. Rootedness isn't simply about staying in one place, it's about what that place represents. It represents years of knowing how the light hits the room in the late afternoon. It represents the rhythm of footsteps on a floor worn down in the exact places you've walked the most. It holds your voice within its walls, even when you are silent. It is a place where time has gathered itself around you, folding your life into something tangible, something that can be touched. And when that is gone, when you willingly or reluctantly walk away from it, something vital loosens inside. You don't feel it all at once. It arrives in small waves. You look for the cupboard that no longer exists. You reach for a light switch in the wrong place. You lose more than orientation. You lose parts of yourself encoded in those movements. The brain must now rebuild its entire map of belonging, but it does so reluctantly, resisting the idea that safety can exist elsewhere. There's a particular kind of silence that follows you into a new space when you leave a home after 60. It's not the peaceful quiet of solitude, it's the absence of echoes. New walls don't know your laughter. New floors haven't held your weary feet. New neighbors aren't part of the continuity that once wove meaning into your days. And that absence begins to feel like an accusation, like proof that you've stepped out of sync with yourself. People say it's just a house, as though that minimizes the weight of what was lost. But houses hold us when nothing else does. They hold us in grief, in illness, in conflict, in celebration. They are where we retreat when the world becomes too much. They are where we become who we are in the privacy and pain and quiet of ordinary life. And when we leave them, we don't just walk away from walls. We walk away from accumulated history that refuses to follow. For many, rootedness means connection to a neighborhood that remembers you. It means the corner store clerk who knows your usual order. It means the tree out front you planted with your partner who is no longer here. These small relationships, these touch points, create a net that holds you gently in place. When that net disappears, you're not just geographically displaced, you're relationally unthreaded. The world becomes bigger, colder, and strangely indifferent. You start to wonder where you belong, not in the existential sense, but physically, daily. Where is the spot that knows your morning routine? Where is the space that forgives you on hard days and celebrates you on good ones? It's not in the neutral-toned walls of a downsized apartment or the polished surfaces of a new residence. It was in the scuffed floor beneath your old chair, in the mark on the wall you never painted over because it reminded you of the time your grandchild scribbled with a crayon. There's grief in this loss, though no one tells you to name it. Society celebrates mobility and reinvention, but it rarely acknowledges the emotional cost of uprooting. especially after 60, when time has accumulated meaning in everything you touch. A coffee mug is not just a mug. It's the one you used every morning on the back porch where you watched the sunrise while the world was still quiet. These objects, these rituals, these places, they carry more of you than you realize. Rootedness is not stagnation, it is richness. It is the reward of commitment, of staying put long enough for a place to learn you. It's the luxury of not having to explain yourself constantly because the environment already understands. And when that is gone, when you must start over in a world that doesn't know your name, it is not exciting, it is profoundly lonely. It is not invigorating. It is a quiet reminder that the things which once held you now exist only in memory. There is no replacement for that kind of knowing. No new condo can replicate the feeling of walking through a garden you planted 20 years ago, of seeing the kitchen tile you chose when your children were still young, of feeling the dent in the couch where you read every book that shaped your thinking. This depth of familiarity is earned over decades, not purchased in a transaction. And when it's gone, the soul begins the slow work of mourning something no one else can see. You might hang pictures, arrange furniture, create a new routine, but deep inside, there remains an ache, a hunger to return to the soil you once called your own. Not out of sentimentality, but because that soil still carries your story, still holds your footprints, still waits for the sound of your voice. The erosion of community is not always sudden. It is often slow, imperceptible at first, until one day you look around and realize the world no longer feels like it's holding you. For decades, the neighborhood wasn't just where you lived, it was a living organism, one that remembered your name, your habits, your stories. It offered structure without demand, familiarity without obligation. It mirrored your existence back to you in 1,000 quiet ways, reinforcing that you were part of something larger than yourself. A community is not defined by proximity alone. It is formed through repetition, trust, and time. You knew the faces, not just the names. You recognized the dog that barked every evening at 6, the old man who swept his porch even in the snow, the teenager who grew up 2 houses down and now helps carry groceries for the elderly woman across the street. These small details built an invisible framework, a web of mutual awareness and subtle care that grounded your place in the world. When you leave that, when you step into a new environment after 60 or 70, you are not entering neutral ground. You are stepping outside of the system that once upheld you. The strangers next door do not know your story. The people at the market have no idea how long you waited to be called by your first name. There is no shared history, no accumulated understanding. What once was effortless now requires explanation, and that burden is felt most acutely when one is already weary. A community acts like a soft barrier against isolation. It keeps loneliness at bay, not by force, but by familiarity. You wave without thinking, you greet without pretense. These exchanges are small but vital. They remind you that you are seen. When you lose that, when you step into a world where your presence is irrelevant, the psychological cost is deeper than expected. The silence in a new place is not peace, it is absence. And absence is loud when you have known belonging. In your old community, even conflict had meaning. The neighbor who borrowed your tools and never returned them, the noise complaints from the house on the corner. These things were part of the rhythm. There was an intimacy to the imperfection. When you move away, you don't just lose the positive, you lose the whole emotional ecosystem. And in that loss, you find yourself flattened, removed from the textured reality that once shaped your days. The erosion of community also dismantles routine. The morning coffee run to the same shop, the walks along familiar streets, the way people used to wave at you by name, all of it disappears. The new environment may be clean, efficient, even beautiful, but it lacks your history. It is not that the place is wrong, but that it is blank. You are no longer part of a shared script. You are now improvising every moment, and that kind of improvisation drains rather than energizes. There is a dignity in being known, in being remembered. You once lived in a neighborhood where people saw you age gradually, not suddenly. They noticed when you limped, when your partner passed, when your laughter returned. These shared observations built a safety net that was not always spoken, but always there. Without it, life becomes more performative. You find yourself curating your presence for strangers rather than simply existing in the comfort of those who already know your tone and your silence. The loneliness that arises from this erosion is not always dramatic. It's the quiet ache when you realize you have no one to ask about local news, no one to call when the power goes out, no one who drops by simply because they always have. It's the shift from being part of a community's memory to being a ghost in a place untouched by your past. That feeling isn't about nostalgia, it's about the psychological infrastructure that made life feel real, stable, and shared. People underestimate how much their mental health was held together by these subtle social threads: a passing conversation at the mailbox, the familiar cashier who asked about your kids, the neighbor who brought soup when you were sick. None of these things were dramatic acts of love, but together they created a sense of mattering. When you move and those interactions vanish, the absence is not easily replaced by occasional texts or scheduled visits from distant family. Technology cannot substitute for community. A video call does not recreate the experience of sitting on the porch with someone who understands the cadence of your breathing. Online groups cannot replicate the unspoken comfort of walking into a room where people know your story without it needing to be told. The erosion of community leaves a void that cannot be filled with convenience. It can only be filled with time, presence, and shared space, and those are not easily recreated after a certain age. There's a certain grief that comes when you realize you are no longer embedded in other people's daily lives. You are no longer the one they check in on, laugh with, grumble about the weather with. You become someone they might meet, but not someone they've grown with. And for someone who has spent decades being part of the fabric of a neighborhood, this shift is not freeing, it is disorienting. You begin to feel like a visitor in your own life, and that unfamiliarity begins to harden into detachment. And then there is the question of contribution. In your old community, you had a role. You might have been the one who looked after the neighbor's plants, or helped fix the fence, or gave advice to younger parents who were just learning. That role gave shape to your self-perception. In a new environment, that contribution is paused indefinitely. You are no longer needed in the way you once were, and even if no one says it, you feel it. You begin to wonder what you're still meant to offer, and that wondering is painful when you know how much you once gave. The erosion of community is not a crisis of geography, it is a crisis of meaning. It is the quiet unraveling of all the subtle, unacknowledged bonds that once tethered you to the world and told you that you mattered. When those bonds are gone, what replaces them is not always loneliness, it is a deeper kind of exile. The kind where you can be surrounded by people and still feel like no one sees you. The myth of starting over is sold as a promise, but what it often delivers is disruption. It's the kind of idea that appeals to those who are dissatisfied, those who believe that by changing their surroundings they can somehow rewrite their story. And yet, after a certain age, after 60, after 70, the notion that you can begin again is not just misleading, it's psychologically hazardous. Because by then you are no longer building from scratch, you are living from accumulation, from experience, from deeply laid roots that cannot simply be transplanted without consequence. There is an entire culture pushing this idea that reinvention is the highest virtue, that you can shed your past like a coat, walk into a new environment, and suddenly become someone else, lighter, freer, better. But the truth is, you are not a blank slate. You are a composite of decades. You carry your memories in your bones, your habits in your muscle, your values in the way you walk into a room. To ignore that in pursuit of a myth is to wage war against your own coherence. Starting over sounds bold. It sounds courageous. But when that rhetoric is applied to the elderly, to those who have already endured the slow labor of becoming, it can become cruel. It suggests that what they've built isn't worth keeping, that the years of effort and connection can be casually discarded in favor of something more fresh or modern. But freshness means nothing if it has no memory, and modernity is hollow when it does not honor what came before. The cost of starting over at an older age is not just logistical, it's existential. You lose more than possessions when you move, you lose context. You lose the subtle feedback loop that tells you who you are in the eyes of others. You lose the symbols and routines that give shape to your days. A new place may offer convenience, but it does not offer history. And history, especially personal history, is what gives life continuity and depth. People underestimate how much of identity is embedded in place. The corner where you always paused on your walk, the cafe where the waitress knows your order without asking, the tree outside your bedroom window. that's been growing along with your grief, your joy, your waiting. These are not trivial details. They are anchors, and when you rip them out in the name of starting over, you don't just lose the past, you lose orientation in the present. There's also a kind of fatigue that sets in with age, not a lack of energy, but a deeper kind of weariness that comes from the sheer volume of lived experience. You've fought your battles, you've built and rebuilt. The idea of doing it all again from scratch may look noble from the outside, but internally it can feel like a kind of erasure, as if everything you've endured no longer counts because you chose or were pushed to begin again. That erasure is quiet, but it corrodes the sense of self. Even the language around starting over is deceptive. New beginnings imply that the old has ended, that it's no longer useful. But in reality, the old doesn't vanish, it haunts the new. The past continues to speak, whether you want it to or not. You might change your location, but you don't change your memories. You might meet new people, but they don't know the texture of your life. They don't know what you've lost, what you've survived, what you've loved. And so you live in this strange limbo between being seen and being invisible. What's often needed after a certain age is not novelty, but depth, not reinvention, but refinement, to stay in place and dig deeper, to allow the roots to thicken, the connections to mature. But the myth of starting over tells you that your worth lies in your ability to be flexible, to adapt, to always be ready to move. That myth doesn't take into account the emotional architecture required to sustain such change. It doesn't ask what's being sacrificed in the process. And for many, starting over is not a free choice. It's a response to loss, to financial pressure, to changing circumstances. It's presented as liberation, but often it is necessity in disguise. And to call that freedom is to deny the grief that comes with it. Because starting over, especially late in life, is rarely an act of liberation. More often, it is a quiet negotiation with forces outside your control, forces that tell you it's time to move on, whether you're ready or not. The myth also fails to account for the social fabric that is torn in the process. You leave behind neighbors who watched you age, friends who shared your memories, familiar routines that grounded you. In the name of a new chapter, you turn the page, but the ink from the last one bleeds through, and you begin to understand that stories aren't written in neat, separated chapters. They are layered, messy, and continuous. You don't start over, you carry forward. Starting over implies a kind of optimism, but also a kind of amnesia. It asks you to forget what once was in order to embrace what could be. But forgetting is not healing, and erasing is not transformation. The strength of a life well lived lies in integration, in honoring what has come before, even as you move into what comes next. The myth of starting over doesn't leave space for that nuance. It promises a clean break when what's needed is a deeper continuity. This myth is particularly dangerous when it is marketed to those who are vulnerable, those who have lost a spouse, who are downsizing, who are told they must now shrink their lives to fit into smaller boxes. It sells them the idea that smaller is simpler, that new is better, but it never asks whether the soul can thrive without the accumulated weight of its own experience. It never asks whether the cost of letting go might be too great for what is offered in return. And so the idea persists, shiny and seductive, promising clarity but delivering confusion. It turns rich, lived lives into projects to be restarted. It makes people question the value of what they've built, simply because it doesn't look new. And in doing so, it disorients those who have spent a lifetime orienting themselves toward meaning rather than novelty. The psychological toll of displacement is not merely a matter of location. It is a fracturing of identity, a rupture in the quiet continuity that makes life feel stable. When a person is uprooted from their home, whether by necessity or by choice, they are not just leaving behind a physical space, they are leaving behind a framework that once held them together. A home is more than walls. It is a landscape of memories, a place where the self is reflected back through routine, familiarity, and belonging. When that structure is lost, the mind struggles to reorient, and in that struggle, a deeper kind of disconnection sets in. There is a profound exhaustion that accompanies displacement, not simply because of the logistics of moving, but because of the cognitive burden of reestablishing a sense of place, the small unconscious acts that once required no thought, finding a cup in the cupboard, knowing which creaky step to avoid, predicting the way the light changes in the evening, suddenly become deliberate, effortful. The mind, already fatigued by the weight of years, is now forced to reconfigure itself in an unfamiliar space, and that demand is not insignificant. It is the kind of exhaustion that accumulates, making even simple tasks feel daunting. Displacement disrupts the continuity of self. A person is in many ways shaped by their environment, not just in a physical sense, but in a deeply psychological one. The streets you walked for decades, the chair that molded to your body, the tree outside your window that changed with the seasons, these things were part of your internal landscape, woven into your emotional reality. When they are gone, you are not simply in a new place, you are, in a very real sense, unmoored. The subconscious cues that once anchored you to the world have vanished, and in their absence, a subtle but persistent disorientation takes hold. This kind of psychological displacement is often mistaken for simple nostalgia, but it is something deeper, something more insidious. Nostalgia is a longing for the past, but displacement is an inability to fully exist in the present. It is the sense that something fundamental has been lost, that the new environment does not recognize you in the way the old one did. It is an invisible form of exile, one that is not easily named but is deeply felt. And the most painful part is that the world does not acknowledge it as real loss. It sees it as an adjustment period, as something temporary, when in truth, it is a permanent fracture. Loneliness is not just a social condition. It is a psychological response to a lack of familiarity. When a person is displaced, even if they are surrounded by people, they are alone in a profound way. The connections they once had, neighbors who knew their routines, shopkeepers who greeted them by name, the unspoken recognition of shared history, are gone. In their place is anonymity, and anonymity, especially after a certain age, is a slow erosion of the self. To be unseen in a place where you once mattered is not merely isolating, it is dehumanizing. There is a particular cruelty in the assumption that displacement is an opportunity for reinvention, that a person, no matter how old, can simply start fresh, adapt, and embrace the new. But reinvention is not the same as integration, and for many, starting over is not liberating, it is exhausting. The burden of carving out new routines, of forming new relationships, of making oneself known in an unfamiliar place is a task that becomes heavier with age. It is not that adaptation is impossible, but that it comes at a psychological cost that is rarely acknowledged. Displacement also alters the way time is experienced. In a familiar environment, time moves in a way that is fluid, effortless. The seasons shift, but the landscape remains, creating a sense of continuity. In an unfamiliar place, time becomes jagged, fragmented. Each day feels longer because it requires more conscious effort to navigate. The brain, no longer able to rely on the automatic familiarity of place, is forced into a constant state of alertness, and that vigilance drains energy in ways that are imperceptible but relentless. Even memory is affected by displacement. The past does not exist in isolation. It is tied to places, to smells, to textures that trigger recollection. When those cues are removed, memory itself becomes more distant, less accessible. A person might remember an event, but without the familiar backdrop, the memory feels untethered, less vivid, less real. It is as if displacement erases not just the present stability, but also the ability to fully access the past, leaving a person stranded between what was and what is. The body does not adjust to displacement as quickly as people assume. There is a deep physiological response to being in a new place, an underlying restlessness that comes from the nervous system's need for familiarity. Sleep patterns are disrupted, digestion shifts, even the way a person moves through space feels different. These are not minor inconveniences, they are signals of a system struggling to recalibrate, to regain a sense of safety in an environment that does not yet feel like home. There is also the question of purpose. In a long-standing home, a person's role is clear. They are a part of something. A neighborhood, a routine, a network of shared history. When that is stripped away, so too is the sense of being needed. A new place does not immediately offer a role, and without one, a person can feel adrift, irrelevant. It is not just a matter of making new friends or finding new hobbies. It is about re-establishing a sense of mattering, and that is not easily done when the foundation has been pulled out from under them. Displacement in its essence is a kind of forced forgetting. It severs a person from the physical markers of their own existence, from the spaces that bore witness to their life, and in doing so it creates a silent, unspoken grief, a grief that is difficult to articulate because it is not tied to a single event, but to an ongoing absence. It is the grief of waking up in a place that does not yet recognize you, of moving through days that feel disconnected from the ones that came before. This grief is compounded by the expectation that one should simply adjust, move on, make the best of it. But displacement does not resolve itself through sheer willpower. It lingers, shaping the way a person interacts with the world. It makes them hesitate before investing in new relationships, cautious about forming attachments to a place that might one day reject them as well. It creates a kind of guarded existence, where belonging feels temporary, and home feels like something that can be lost at any moment. And in the end, displacement is not just about geography, it is about identity. A person is not merely where they live, they are the sum of their attachments, their memories, their sense of place. To be displaced is to have that identity fractured, to be forced into a state of transition that does not always lead to something better. And the most difficult part is that the world expects resilience when sometimes what is needed is recognition of the cost. The underestimation of nostalgia begins with the casual way it is dismissed as sentimental indulgence, as if looking back with longing is somehow weak or regressive. But nostalgia is not a retreat into the past, it is a deep psychological mechanism that serves to remind us who we are and where we've come from. It is not a symptom of stagnation, but a sign of internal coherence, a form of emotional integration that gives continuity to the self across time. In a culture obsessed with progress, nostalgia is often treated like an obstacle. Forward motion is praised, reinvention is glorified, and any glance backward is seen as a failure to adapt. Yet this view fails to recognize that human beings are narrative creatures. We require memory to build identity. We need to recall the texture of our lives, the music that moved us, the voices that shaped us, the places where we felt most alive, in order to understand our present position. Without nostalgia, the story fractures. Nostalgia is not a distortion of memory, it is a form of selective attention that serves a purpose. It highlights the moments of beauty, meaning, and connection that made life feel whole, even in difficult times. It draws attention not just to what was, but to what mattered. In that sense, nostalgia isn't an escape, it's a compass. It shows us the shape of our values. It reveals what we long for, not because we can't move on, but because we know precisely what we're moving toward. The subtle ache of nostalgia is not weakness, it is a marker of depth. It is the mind's way of preserving meaning, of maintaining a sacred thread through all the years. That thread isn't broken by time, it's strengthened by it. When someone speaks of childhood homes, old songs, lost friends, they aren't just being sentimental, they are engaging in an act of psychological preservation. They are fighting against the erosion of significance in a world that constantly urges them to forget and move on. One of the most overlooked aspects of nostalgia is its power to stabilize the self during times of upheaval. When life becomes disoriented through loss, relocation, aging, or societal disruption, nostalgia provides a tether. It allows a person to reconnect with the version of themselves that felt grounded, purposeful, understood. It's not about reliving the past, it's about carrying forward what the past gave you, about reminding yourself of your own durability through time. This stabilizing function is especially crucial as people grow older. Aging is not just a biological process, it's a psychological recalibration. The future begins to narrow and the past expands. Nostalgia is not only natural in this phase, it is necessary. It helps integrate the life lived with the life still unfolding. It brings coherence to the narrative. And yet, society often urges older individuals to forget, to let go, to declutter even their emotional lives in the name of lightness. But memory is not clutter, it is the architecture of identity. There is also a communal element to nostalgia that is frequently ignored. Shared memories are the glue of relationships. Families are not bound by blood alone, but by the collective remembrance of meals shared, holidays celebrated, struggles endured. Friendships deepen through the repetition of old stories, the familiar jokes that only make sense within that shared history. Nostalgia reinforces these social bonds, not by trapping people in the past, but by reminding them of why the connection matters. In a digital age where the present is constantly overridden by the next post, the next trend, the next distraction, nostalgia serves as an act of resistance. It says, this mattered, this was real, this deserves to be remembered. And in that act, it reclaims meaning from the relentless churn of the new. It gives permission to hold on to things that shaped us, even if they no longer exist in material form. That holding is not regression, it is reverence. The underestimation of nostalgia is also a failure to grasp its role in healing. When people suffer loss, nostalgia becomes the bridge between absence and memory. It allows for grief to take shape. It gives the pain a place to rest. It allows us to visit what is no longer physically present and find comfort in the imprint it left. In that sense, nostalgia is not merely a feeling, it is a process of emotional repair. Nostalgia has creative force as well. Artists, writers, thinkers often draw from the reservoir of memory to construct something new. They reach into the past not to copy it, but to transform it into something that speaks to the present. Nostalgia here becomes a catalyst, a starting point for imagination, not just a holding place for longing. The past is not static. When revisited through the lens of nostalgia, it becomes dynamic, instructive, alive. We also forget that nostalgia can be profoundly instructive. It teaches us about values. The things we miss are often the things that mattered most to us, things we didn't even realize we needed until they were gone. This reflective aspect is not trivial. It is clarifying. It helps prioritize what is truly meaningful in a world of endless options and distraction. It cuts through the noise of modern life with a whisper of memory that says, this was real, this was yours. And yet, because nostalgia doesn't shout, it is easily overlooked. It doesn't demand attention like urgency or novelty. It arrives quietly, often uninvited, sometimes in the form of a scent or a song, and lingers just long enough to remind you of something essential. That quietness is misinterpreted as irrelevance, but in truth, it speaks to the depth of its influence. It doesn't seek to dominate, it seeks to remind. And reminders, especially those that connect us to meaning, are the scaffolding of a coherent life. The tragedy is that so many people dismiss nostalgia because they mistake it for weakness. But to feel deeply is not to regress, it is to remember fully. And those who remember fully are often the ones most rooted in purpose, most resilient in change, most awake to the beauty that persists across time.